Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are looking at something that was truly a seismic event in the history of religious exposés. I'm talking about Nan Suk Hong's 1998 memoir, In the Shadow of the Moon. I mean, when this book dropped, it was just massive. Hong was married to Reverend Sun Myung Moon's own son, his third son, Yeojin Moon. And her account of life inside what they called the true family, it basically gave the public this immediate, emotionally potent smoking gun.
It was a searing portrait, wasn't it? It detailed just staggering hypocrisy, abuse, materialism, all at the very core of the Unification movement, the FFWPU.
Right, and it seemed to confirm every single external suspicion that this whole church was just defined by the corruption at the top.
And that devastating public image, which was based on Hong's undeniably real suffering, that is precisely what we are deep diving into today. Our mission here is to analyze a pretty rigorous counter-critique of the memoir.
Okay, but we should be really clear up front.
Absolutely. This is not about defending the personal failures of the Moon family. Those are, they're acknowledged facts. Instead, we're challenging the book's assertion that it works as a comprehensive sociological indictment of the global movement.
So it's not about her story, but what her story was used to represent.
Exactly. The core counter-argument is it's fascinatingly subtle. It posits that Hong's unique position, her proximate observation being a total insider, paradoxically served to distort and narrow her view of the entire thing.
Okay, hold on. Let's unpack that, the bias of intimacy.
Yeah.
Because the entire genre of the apostate memoir, it relies on that proximity, right?
Of course.
We read these books because the author had, unparalleled access. She was living in the Moon compound. The promise is, trust the person who was closest to the secret. So why should we distrust her?
Because intimacy is a powerful lens, but it's often a very, very focused one. It can suffer from what academics call the problem of conflation. Hong's narrative, it makes this fundamental error. It assumes a seamless, monolithic link between the personal morality of the founder, let's call him the occupant,
Okay.
and the theological efficacy of the institution, the office.
The person versus the position.
Precisely. And you have to think about the internal pressure. In Unification theology, the true family wasn't just some wealthy family. They were supposed to be the actual template of perfected humanity.
Living proof that the whole system worked.
Yes. So when that template failed so catastrophically, through substance abuse, violence, all of it, Hong concluded the entire theological structure must crumble. Her personal betrayal led her to assume that if the family is corrupt, the entire global mission must be a fraud.
But I have to push back on that a little. For a movement like this, a highly centralized, charismatic movement, where the founder claims a unique connection to God, isn't separating the occupant and the office nearly impossible. If the template fails, doesn't the whole idea fail?
That's a completely valid challenge, and it's one scholars grapple with. But if you look at history, religious movements often persist long after the founder, fails morally. Look at almost any major religion. Scandals have plagued founders, early leaders, yet the structure and the doctrine survive.
Because the community finds its own meaning.
The communal experience takes root, independent of the leader's perfection. And that is the crucial distinction Hong's account misses. Her critique of the ideal failed to engage with the reality of this decentralized faith experience.
Right. For the tens of thousands of members around the world, their faith wasn't about the founder's kids.
Not at all. It was based on their own lived spiritual experiences, the power of those mass marriage ceremonies, deep communal bonds that were thousands of miles from the Moon residences. Their commitment for them solved a spiritual problem in their lives, and that experience was real no matter what was happening in New York.
And the book's very structure, as an exposé, forces a certain kind of story onto all that complexity.
Absolutely. That's the narrative teleology of the genre. The story has to build toward a morally righteous escape. It demands emotional clarity, which means you have to sacrifice complexity. Every anecdote has to serve the one goal of proving the whole thing was fraudulent. So you prioritize the most sensational instances of luxury and abuse.
The stuff designed to shock an outside audience.
Exactly. So she correctly identified the specialized pathology, the immense, insane pressure on the founder's children. But she mistook that family dysfunction for a general institutional failure. She narrowed the scope of her own critique.
She was looking at the symptom and declaring the whole body dead.
That's a perfect way to put it, without analyzing the structure that created those symptoms in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's shift gears, because the other part of her critique that really grabbed people was the money. In Section 2, let's look at the wealth. One of her most devastating lines of attack detailed the hypocrisy of the family's private wealth. Mansions, private jets, these extravagant shopping sprees, especially by Hak Moon.
Yeah.
And this was all happening while the general members were told to live these austere, sacrificial, often poor lives.
And this is where the counter-critique brings in this idea of a theology of sacred finances.
Hmm.
To you or me, to the external world, it looks like straightforward theft. You're siphoning member donations for personal use.
Right.
But the internal rationale was deeply ingrained in the mission itself. Inside the movement, all resources were rationalized as being dedicated to establishing Chian el-Guk, God's kingdom on earth.
So the money wasn't for them, it was for God's mission, which they happened to be leading.
That's the logic. And we're not talking about petty cash. The wealth supported huge, capital-intensive projects, things like founding the Washington Times, multiple universities, high-level political lobbying, these sprawling interfaith organizations. These things cost billions.
So while Hong is documenting funds being used for personal gain, which seems undeniable, the counter-critique is saying she completely ignores the institutional logic for why they had that much wealth to begin with.
She discounts the scale and the rationale. So when Hong, watching from the East Coast compound, saw a luxury yacht, she saw proof of personal greed. But the counter-critique points out that long-term members who are steeped in this ideology, they often saw the same yacht as a strategic asset.
For what?
Maybe for diplomatic outreach, maybe it was a necessary platform for some prophetic event, who knows? But it was viewed through the lens of mission fulfillment.
Okay, but that raises a question for you then. Is the argument that the resources weren't misused? Or is it that the misuse was just a smaller piece of the pie than the overall mission's budget? Because the public hears yacht and just assumes the whole thing is a scam.
The argument is that the critique, based on her very limited view, makes the misuse look like the entire enterprise. Which brings us to the geographical limits of her story. Her focus was almost exclusively on the domestic life of the Moon family, mainly in their East Coast residences.
Irvington, New York.
Right. And this tunnel vision, it just minimizes the sheer scope of the movement by the 1990s. The Unification Church was a multifaceted conglomerate. They were in high-stakes negotiations in post-Soviet Russia, running huge economic projects in South Korea, massive endeavors in Africa, Asia, Latin America.
So by framing this whole transnational organization as just a funding engine for the leader's private excesses, she created a severe imbalance. She missed the real economic footprint.
Absolutely. The indictment became personalized, sensationalized. It lacked the historical and economic context to assess what a global faith organization actually does with billions of dollars. She reduced a vast operation to a handful of luxury purchases.
That sets up our third section perfectly. Because if the goal is a real critique, one that lasts, you have to move beyond character flaws and look at the systemic failures. What did her personal focus miss about the movement's actual structure?
A lot. She focused almost entirely on the Moon family as the source of the rot. But a movement of this scale, it depends on the surrounding leadership. The chief lieutenants, the financial managers, the original members.
The people who enabled it.
The dedicated followers who surrounded the family. These are the people who enabled, concealed, and facilitated the family's actions, all under the theological mandate of absolute, unquestioning obedience.
So she saw the problem in the family, but she failed to ask why the system let that problem fester for so long.
Exactly. The memoir never asks that deeper question. Why did these trusted senior members permit or just ignore this dysfunction for decades? By limiting the blame to the family, Hong sidestepped a much more profound conclusion, which is that the movement itself developed these structural pathologies rooted in its centralized, almost militaristic doctrine that let the abuse continue.
And the counter-critique also says the book lacked any real scholarly engagement. It just relied on cult rhetoric and betrayal drama.
Yes, that's a key omission. It operated in isolation from the academic field of new religious movement studies. Had Hong or her ghostwriter used critical concepts, the analysis could have been so much stronger. For instance, she could have applied Max Weber's theory of charisma, which explains how this kind of authority can become fragile, or analyze the structure's impact on individual autonomy.
So you're saying she focused on the shopping trips and the arguments, but failed to connect those private failures to the organizational doctrine, that principle of absolute obedience that actually fueled them.
That's precisely the point. A comprehensive critique would have used the personal drama as empirical evidence to illustrate the dangers of absolute centralized spiritual authority. But instead, she prioritized the shock value of the personal details, which, it satisfied the public's hunger for an expose, but it dodged any kind of durable institutional analysis.
Okay, let's pivot to section 4. Let's talk about the reception, because the timing of this book was so critical. It was published during a period of intense cult panic in the West. This was post-Waco, post-Heaven's Gate, and Hong's identity, well-educated, chosen by Moon himself, a victim of abuse, it made her the ideal tragic witness. The book gave the world an emotionally potent reason to just dismiss the entire movement.
And what's so fascinating is the split in reception. The secular world treated the book as the definitive, unassailable truth. It reinforced their pre-existing bias. But the reaction among long-term dedicated unificationists was, well, profoundly complex, and it's critical to understanding why the movement survived.
So it didn't cause a mass exodus.
No, that's what everyone expected. Instead, for many members, the book actually cemented a painful internal theological process. It forced them to separate the principle, the divine revelation that drew them in, from the person, the profoundly imperfect messengers, the Moon family.
So when they were faced with this undeniable evidence of the family's failings, they didn't conclude the mission was a fraud.
No, they concluded the family had failed its divine responsibility.
But the mission, their own spiritual experiences, that all remained intact.
Exactly. They saw the family's failure as a tragedy within the mission, not as proof that the mission was false. The book became a sort of painful purification ritual. It forced them to re-anchor their faith away from the individuals and back onto the community and the doctrine. That internal reinterpretation is the ultimate proof of the memoir's limits as a sociological tool. It failed to dismantle the faith.
So what does this all mean for us today? The book was designed to prove the entire structure was a lie. Yet for so many inside, it became a catalyst for reaffirming the mission's value, just without the messenger's integrity. That psychological resilience really shows the limits of Hong's critique.
It does, and we have to reaffirm the value of the memoir. It is a necessary and, yes, a painful document of personal survival. It rightfully shattered the public facade of the True family.
It gave a voice to victims.
It did. But the core conclusion of the counter-critique is that the memoir's effectiveness as a personal story is inversely proportional to its accuracy as a comprehensive analysis. The tyranny of intimacy led Hong to swap the hard work of sociological critique for the immediate gratification of an exposé.
It's easier to tell a story about a bad person than a flawed system.
Much easier. And that leaves us with this final, provocative thought for you to consider. To truly understand the history and the influence of any global faith movement, we have to look beyond the shadow cast by a founder's personal failures. We have to engage with the structural, the doctrinal, and the communal dimensions that keep it running long after the leader is gone. The enduring value of Hong's text rests not as a definitive history, but as a tragic, intimate warning about the perils of placing absolute spiritual faith in profoundly imperfect terrestrial vessels.